In 1994, the United States forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Washington, which stated that Ukraine's territorial integrity would be respected and the country was not going to become a target of economic coercion. In 2025, the President of the United States blamed Ukraine for the war that Russia started. He also decided not to honor the previous security agreements signed by the United States by demanding payback that is much bigger than the actual support that the United States provided to Ukraine, and initially proposed an economic deal that would make the United States plunder the Ukrainian land. What we are seeing today is the betrayal by the United States of its allies, its partners, and its principles. It is not the first time when the United States betrayed Ukraine, but the consequences this time will be much bigger, not just for the people of Ukraine and the citizens of the United States, but also for the whole world. What we saw at the White House last week, when the President of the United States threatened the President of Ukraine, was nothing new. In the summer of 1991, American President H.W. Bush, during his trip to the Soviet Union, visited Moscow, after which he traveled to Kyiv and warned Ukrainians, during his speech to the Ukrainian parliament, not to declare independence and remain a part of the Soviet Union. This has angered Ukrainians, who finally, after several centuries of struggle, got a chance to break free from Moscow's influence. 3 weeks after that speech was made, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the Declaration of Independence, and 4 months later, in December of 1991, Ukraine became an independent state. Although the Soviet Union collapsed, Moscow began working on restoring its dominance over the former satellite states through economic and military means. Despite this, the United States still foolishly believed that Moscow had no plans to restore its former empire. That is why in 1994, the Clinton administration behind the closed doors threatened Ukraine with economic sanctions, similar to the ones that it implemented against North Korea, and warned of diplomatic isolation if Kyiv did not dismantle its nuclear arsenal, which was bigger than the combined nuclear arsenals of France, the United Kingdom, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea at that time. Only Russia and the United States had a bigger nuclear arsenal. As part of the deal, the United States also forced Ukraine to transfer all of its strategic bombers to Russia. In exchange for this, the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom signed security assurances, which stated that those countries committed to respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity and also committed to refraining from using economic coercion against the country. Ukraine had little choice at that time, as the country faced economic troubles following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and agreed to sign the document on American terms, which is now known as the Budapest Memorandum. Without its nuclear arsenal, it became impossible for Ukraine to deter the Russian invasion in 2014 and 2022. At the same time, Russia to this day uses the same strategic bombers that Ukraine gave it under American security assurances to launch cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities almost every week. Under the George W. Bush administration, the relationships with Ukraine were improving, and Ukraine even participated in American-led coalition in Iraq and Afghanistan following 9/11. But while the American administration was focused on the Middle East, it was not prepared to face new challenges coming from Moscow. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, the response from the West was muted, which gave Russia a signal that it could continue to invade other countries in Europe and not face major consequences. It was only in 2009, during the transition period in the United States, when George W. Bush warned Barack Obama to watch out for Russia, which he believed would invade Ukraine in the future and use the Crimean Peninsula as a jumping-off point. Despite this, the Obama administration decided to reset relations with Russia, made sure that Ukraine fully gave up its remaining stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and helped Ukraine dismantle its old short-range ballistic missile. After disarming Ukraine throughout all of those years, it became impossible to deter the Russian invasion that happened in 2014, when the Russian army invaded Crimea along with the eastern parts of the country. Then the Obama administration made the same mistake as all the previous American administrations, and decided not to make Russia face any major consequences for its invasion, even though it had the power to do so, which gave Moscow another signal that it could continue its military expansion in Europe. What the Obama administration did was send non-lethal aid to Ukraine and offered strong words of condemnation of Russian actions without any serious action. It was only in 2017 that the Americans approved the first sale of lethal aid, which included the Javelin anti-tank systems. However, in 2019, the Trump administration decided to halt another shipment of weapons approved by the American Congress until the Ukrainian government interferes in the American elections by investigating Trump's political opponents who in the past conducted business in Ukraine. This later resulted in Trump's impeachment in the House of Representatives. Under the Biden administration, the relations did not improve much before the full-scale invasion invasion, especially after the American administration waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was expected to make Europe even more dependent on Russian natural gas and help Moscow exert more influence in Europe. When the Russian army began to pull troops to the Ukrainian border in the spring of 2021, President Biden offered to meet Putin in Switzerland to defuse the tensions. However, during the summit in Geneva, Biden signaled that Ukraine was not a top-tier priority of the administration. Then a couple of months later, the United States failed to properly leave Afghanistan, which had a profound impact on global perception of American leadership. During that time, the Ukrainian special forces also helped rescue hundreds of citizens from Europe and America before the country was captured by the Taliban. All of those moves of the Biden administration emboldened Putin to escalate the tensions later, when more troops started to arrive at the Ukrainian border, while the Biden administration began publicly sharing intelligence reports about Russia's military buildup near the Ukrainian border to warn Ukraine and Europe about the upcoming war. It explicitly stated that the American troops would not be involved and did not enact any preemptive sanctions, wasting all the opportunities to deter the invasion. Then when President Zelensky officially initiated consultations in the framework of the Budapest Memorandum with the United States, United Kingdom and Russia, no serious dialogue took place, and no security was offered to Ukraine by the document's signatories, as Russian tanks once again rolled into Ukraine on February 24, 2022. While its missiles bombed Ukrainian cities, the Biden administration believed that the Ukrainian capital Kyiv would fall within 72 hours, and the country would be quickly occupied by the Russians. No one believed that Ukraine would be able to survive, and especially regain the initiative on the battlefield. Despite all the expectations, for the first 2 weeks of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine defied all the odds, and on its own, without any major support from the outside, successfully managed to prevent the Russian occupation of Kyiv and most of other regional capitals. The United States and its allies overestimated the Russian military capabilities and underestimated the Ukrainian resolve to resist the invasion and the occupation. Now it was time to fix the mistakes for the American leadership. It was only on March 10, 2022, when the American Congress approved the first significant $13.6 billion aid package that included military assistance, which still took additional time to arrive. Once Ukraine managed to win the Battle of Kyiv by the end of March, only then the Biden administration's calculus shifted from preparing for a collapse of a government in Kyiv to helping Ukraine fight back, since this would make it impossible for Russia to attack a European NATO country when its army is stuck in Ukraine. For Ukraine, the American help meant that the country was able to fulfill the dream of generations of Ukrainians who lived under the Russian occupation for the last 300 years and truly become a sovereign state free of Moscow's influence. The money that the American Congress has been approving since that time mostly remained in the United States and was spent producing munitions and military equipment on American soil in American companies with the help of American workers. It helped the United States revive its industrial capacity and help Ukraine survive the first years of the Russian invasion, for which Ukraine will always be grateful to every American family. However, there were still lots of issues with Biden's approach to war. The Biden administration adopted a failed escalation management strategy, which made it hard for Ukraine to effectively fight back and win the war in the first year of the full-scale invasion. The Biden administration initially warned Ukraine against striking the occupied Crimean Peninsula, fearing it would provoke a severe Russian response. Ukraine later ignored the warning and has been striking key military bases and air defenses on the Crimean Peninsula, sinking and damaging Russian warships in occupied Sevastopol and blowing up the Crimean bridge that connects Crimea with the Russian mainland. As expected, no severe response from the Russia followed. Despite this, the Biden administration stuck with this failed escalation management strategy and also forbade Ukraine from striking targets inside Russia. Ukraine later ignored this advice and has been launching aerial attacks against Russian strategic assets like weapon factories and oil refineries. As expected, no severe response from the Russia followed. Finally, the United States also warned not to invade the Russian territory, which made it impossible for Ukraine to effectively fight back and regain the initiative on the battlefield. That is why Ukraine decided to again ignore the advice and invade the Kursk region in the summer of 2024. As expected, no severe response from the Russia followed. The failed escalation management strategy prevented Ukraine from keeping the momentum and winning the war in the first year of the full-scale invasion, and led to the stalemate on the battlefield, which we are currently witnessing. As the war saw no end in sight, in large because of the failed escalation strategy, the American public got tired of the war, and Donald Trump used this shift shift in sentiment during the presidential campaign to criticize the handling of the war by the Biden administration. He made false promises of quickly ending the war and even pressured the American Congress not to vote for aid to Ukraine in 2024. This made Ukraine fight without American help for more than half a year, since the military aid to Ukraine was halted in January of 2024 when the funding ended. Then Congress approved another aid package only in April of 2024, but by October of 2024, only 10% of the approved aid by the Congress has been delivered. Now that Trump is back in the White House, the American strategy changed from helping Ukraine for as long as it takes to ending the war as soon as possible, no matter what the cost might be. That is why one of the first things that the administration did was meet with the Russian representatives in Saudi Arabia, after which the American State Department cancelled a high-level meeting with the European Union representatives. Then Trump himself blamed Ukraine for the war that Russia started and called the democratically elected President Zelensky a dictator. The Trump team also offered Ukraine to sign a minerals deal without any security guarantees. The deal initially demanded that Ukraine would offer the United States $500 billion worth of its minerals as repayment for the American help, even though the United States in total provided only around $119 billion, most of which was spent in the United States and created jobs for Americans. Finally, on the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the United States sided with countries like Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Sudan, Mali, Nicaragua, Eritrea, Central African Republic by voting against the Ukrainian resolution during the United Nations General Assembly, which called for the establishment of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Even Iran and China abstained and did not vote against the resolution. Then last week, President Trump and Vice President Pence ambushed Ukrainian President Zelensky in the White House meeting by blaming him for his leadership role in fighting Russia and for his lack of gratitude for Americans, which is not true, as he expressed gratitude countless times to all Americans for helping Ukraine repel the Russian invasion. The meeting then ended prematurely, no deal has been signed, and the interaction between both presidents received a blowback across the globe. Make no mistake, what we are witnessing today is the betrayal of Ukraine by the United States. It was the American leadership that forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security, and it is the American leadership that now once again is open to giving concessions to Russians at the expense of Ukraine. The latest proposals of the Trump administration can create a temporary ceasefire, but cannot guarantee the long-term security of Ukraine and cannot guarantee that Russia is not going to invade again like it did in the past. The problem for Ukraine is that while it can sustain the fight without American help, like it did in the first weeks of the invasion and in 2024, when Congress took months to approve the new aid package, it is nevertheless going to become harder to repel the invasion without the American support. Ukraine has enough funding to sustain the fight in 2025. It is developing drones that are responsible for destroying 85% of Russian occupying forces, and the European partners can cover other expenses. The only problem is that Ukraine still relies on the United States for anti-air missiles and intelligence. That is why Ukraine will still look for ways to improve its relations with the United States, despite the latest developments. At the end of the day, it is Moscow that is the true enemy of Ukraine. For more than 3 centuries, Moscow, as a part of the Tsardom of Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the so-called Russian Federation, has occupied parts of Ukraine and at some point even all of Ukraine. It is Moscow that has been banning the Ukrainian language, destroying Ukrainian culture, banning Ukrainian Christian churches, and doing everything it can to erase Ukrainian identity. It continues to do all of this to this day, and that is why it will continue to be the enemy. At the same time, the latest actions of the Trump administration regarding Ukraine are already having a much wider impact on Europe and the whole world. The latest shift in American foreign policy made European countries question the American commitment to the transatlantic alliance and the security architecture that was established in Europe after the creation of NATO in 1949. The Trump administration in the last 2 months has threatened to annex Canada and Greenland, interfered in the German elections, tried to dictate the outcome of Romanian presidential elections, and lectured Europeans about the freedom of speech after it banned American journalists from covering the White House cabinet meetings. There are now also reports that the United States stopped any cybersecurity operations in Russia, while Russia did not do the same thing. At this point, the Trump administration is making the same mistake that H.W. Bush Clinton, Obama, and Biden did when they believed that the relations with Moscow could be restored, even though Moscow always viewed and continues to view the United States as its strategic enemy. The American decision to abruptly reverse its foreign policy and commit to restoring relations with Russia has also become a major issue for the Europeans. While Russia has been engaged in conventional warfare in Ukraine since 2014, it also killed European citizens on European soil, interfered in elections across the continent, violated the airspace of European NATO countries, and sabotaged European cables under the Baltic Sea. That is why there is now a realization that the United States no longer can be trusted and the new security architecture in Europe is needed. Even if the United States elects another president a few years from now, the damage has already been made, and American commitment to the security of Europe will now always be questioned. Major European nations have already agreed to work on a shared peace plan with Ukraine that includes the deployment of European troops to secure a lasting peace once the meaningful ceasefire deal is reached. The European countries are also about to announce a historic program to rearm the European continent in light of new threats. At the same time, no other country will be foolish enough to give up its nuclear arsenal or abandon its nuclear project in exchange for any security guarantees that the United States might provide, as those guarantees are not going to be honored by the Americans over time. At this point, Iran is never going to agree to abandon its nuclear program. France would be required to replace the American nuclear shield with its own nuclear shield to other European countries, and Asian countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and even Japan might now consider going nuclear, considering the rising lack of trust in Americans. At the end of the day, the consequences of making false promises to Ukraine and later betraying Ukraine will have long-term consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for the United States as well. We can already see that the American global image is shattering, as the United States cannot fully be trusted anymore, even if the country elects another president a few years from now. The damage has been done, and all of us are about to enter a more dangerous world that we are not going to like.